I want to talk to you today about finishing well, about completing the work that God has for you to do. One of my favorite verses, one of 1,000 maybe favorite verses, says, "One who puts on his armor should not boast like one who takes it off." Ecclesiastes 7:8 from the Living says, finishing. Finishing is better than starting. We love those famous words where Jesus says his master replied, "Well done." Who doesn't want to hear those words? "Well done, good and faithful servant." Jesus said, "I have brought you glory on earth." He's praying to the Father, and this is just before his death. And the interesting thing is, everyone who needed to be healed has not been healed. Every lesson that needs to be taught has not been taught. The disciples have not been fully discipled. But Jesus said, "I have brought you glory on earth by finishing the work that you gave me to do." At the end of his life, Paul said, "I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I'm not dead yet, but I am done. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith." We all want to hear those magical words, mission accomplished. So we want to look at this passage today and look at what we can learn about Moses' life from finishing the work that God has for us to do. When you read Scripture, you always want to give your group something to look for. And before we read today's passage, we want to go look back in chapter 1 of Exodus, and we read this ominous verse. "Then a new king, to whom Joseph meant nothing, came to power in Egypt." And everything changed for the Jews at this point. When a new king, to whom Joseph meant nothing, came to power in Egypt. And when trouble came to God's people, God raised up a person. God sent a baby. He nearly always sends a baby, and he sent a baby in this case, and that baby was the person of Moses. And he had kind of miraculous circumstances surrounding his birth, which put him as a kind of stepchild to the king, to the Pharaoh. That's why he's sometimes called the prince of Egypt. And then when he's about 40 years old, he saw an Egyptian man beating up on one of his fellow Jews. And he got mad. He got a madman sitting there mad, and he beat up the guy and killed him. And I remember my dad used to say that Moses could not kill a man without his toe sticking up out of the desert sand. And so he fled, and for 40 years, he spent his days wandering around the desert. We can summarize Moses' life this way. He spent 40 years thinking that he was somebody, thinking that he was the prince of Egypt, that he was educated, and he was smart, and he was young, and he was strong, and he was all that. And then he made a big mistake, and he spent 40 years thinking that he was nobody, that he was going nowhere, he was doing nothing, his life would amount to nothing. And then God showed up, and then he spent 40 years seeing what God can do through a man who realizes that he is a nobody, but he is a nobody that God can use. And our story today occurs right in between section 2 and section 3. And it begins, as I will call it, as a day like any other. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, as he tended flocks the day before and the day before and the day before. And he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, also known as Sinai, the mountain of God. We don't know for sure where this is. We think it's down in this southern part of the Sinai Peninsula. But you see, it says Mount Hor. I assume that is with a question mark up there at the top. And I assume that's referring to the fact that some people think it's up there somewhere. But if you Google it, I found this mountain and this mountain, and this mountain is a particular pretty mountain. I remember one of my professors talking about hiking one of these mountains, and when he got his long, grueling hike, and it took a good part of the day to get there. It was hot, and he was sweaty, and he was tired, and he got to the top, and his tour guide told him when he got to the top, "Now we can't be sure that this is the mountain that Moses climbed." If you look it up on Wikipedia, you'll read modern scholars differ as to the exact geographical position of Mount Sinai and Mount Horeb. But at any rate, this day was a day when God was going to break a 40-year silence, and I would say in a way a 400-year silence. There's two places in the Bible where we see a 400-year silence. One is between Malachi and Matthew, and the other is, I often say it's between Genesis and Exodus. It's actually not between Genesis and Exodus. It's between the early part of Genesis and that verse I read just a moment ago. There arose a new king, to whom Joseph meant nothing. And it's about 6 or 8 verses into the book of Exodus. But we read of 400 silent years. And we tend to think of the Bible as a story of just one miracle after another, one day after another, of God speaking and God said this and so on. But we see quite a number of silent years. And for 40 years or 400 years, depending on the way you want to look at it, God had been silent to his people during that period of time. Pause and let that sink in. Through 4 decades, or maybe 4 millennia, in Midian, we have no record of God speaking to Moses, not even one time. But the day that was going to shatter that silence, however, dawned like every other day in the wilderness. The night before, as he was sleeping out under the bright desert stars with his flock, perhaps under the looming shoulder of Mount Sinai, he saw no meteor shower across the sky. He heard no voice. No angel tapped him on the shoulder at breakfast that morning and said, "Pay attention, Moses, pay attention. God is going to speak today." There were no hints, no premonitions, no special signs to alert him to the fact that God himself would break the silence that day and that life would change forever. It was just your common, ordinary, garden variety day shift with the sheep. Nothing more, nothing less, nothing else. Just another day in the wilderness office under the shadow of Mount Horeb. The sun came up, the sheep grazed, and Moses chalked up 14,600th day, that's 365 times 40, as Jethro's assistant shepherd out there in the desert. So it was a day like any other day, and it was a bush like any other bush. Verse 2 says, "And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in the flames of fire from within a bush." Moses saw that although the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, "I will go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up." The Josh Hunt Standard Version has it, "So Moses thought, look at that bush. That is one amazing bush. I can't believe it. Look at that bush. That bush is so amazing." Adrian Rogers quotes Major Ian Thomas, and he says, Major Ian Thomas imagined Moses saying something like this: "Would you look at that bush? Would you look at that bush? Oh, what a marvelous bush. What a marvelous bush that is. It just keeps burning and burning and burning for God." And then he thought about himself, and he thought, I tried to burn for God, and I made myself a pile of ashes in 24 hours, and there's nothing left. But that bush, it just keeps on burning. Wish I could be a bush like that bush. I wish my life could burn for God like that one and just keep on burning, Major Thomas imagined God saying. "Moses, come here, son. I want to tell you something. You think that bush is a wonderful bush? Well, Moses, look here. You see that bush over there? You see that wonderful little bush down in the ravine that gets some extra water down there? You see that bush down there? That bush would do. Or Moses, do you see that bush over there? That bush up on the ridge, so all the water drains off down into the ravine. The extra water that it gets goes to that other bush, and this bush is scraggly and dry and kind of an ugly bush. You see that bush up there, Moses? That bush would have done. I could do the same thing with that bush. Moses, it's not the bush. It's God in the bush. Any old bush will do. You know, sometimes we see a man and we say, "Oh, what a wonderful servant of God he is. I wish I could be like that servant of God. Look at that David Jeremiah. Look at that Rick Warren. Look at that Warren Wiersbe. I wish I could be a servant of God like that. Look what he's doing great for God." And God said, it's not what he's doing. It's what I am doing in him. Any old bush will do. This bush will do. That bush will do. You'll do. Any old bush will do. And mind you, this is not a book. It's a transcripted sermon. And I can picture Adrian Rogers stepping to the edge of the stage and pointing out and saying, "You'll do, and you'll do, and you'll do, and you'll do, and you'll do. Any old bush will do." So it was a day like any other day, and we have a bush like any other bush. But that bush is a symbol of Moses' life, and it is a symbol of what God wanted to teach Moses about finishing well this day. So we want to look at what else can we learn from this story. Verse 4, "When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called him from within the bush, 'Moses, Moses, Moses.' And Moses said, 'Here I am.' 'Do not come any closer,' God said. 'Take off your sandals, for the place you are standing is holy ground.' And then he said, I am the God of your father. I am the God of Abraham. I am the God of Isaac, and I am the God of Jacob. After this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. And it's a bit of a side note, but Tim Chester says a fire often draws you toward it, and when you see God, you'll be drawn toward it, and this fire draws Moses. But equally well, when we see God, we also instinctively want to keep our distance, as Moses wanted to keep his distance from this fire. Verse 7, the Lord said, you were concerned about what you were doing for God. Now I want you to see, I have indeed seen the misery of my people. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the home of the Canaanites and the Hittites and the Amorites and the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, and the Mosquitobites. And now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. So the bush was a symbol for Moses. And the symbol was the idea that you cannot burn on your own, but any bush will do if I am in that bush. And so we see from these verses that it is a task like no other task. And it is a task like no other task because this is God's task. This is God's agenda. Moses, you were going to try to get this done on your own. And now I want you to see that any old bush, you weren't going to get there because of your education. You weren't going to get there because you were the prince of Egypt. You weren't going to get there because you were all that. You were going to get there because I was going to get you there if you got this job done at all. So it was a task like no other task. Henry Blackaby said, God is reconciling the world to himself. God has the task of reconciling a world to himself. Because he loves you, he wants to involve you in his activity. But see that it is his activity. He begins by pursuing a love relationship with you, and then he invites you to become involved with him in his work. But never forget, it is his work. So we see a day like any other day. We see a bush like any other bush. We see a task like no other task because it is God's task. Verse 11, but Moses said to God, who am I? Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? And God said, I will be with you. And this will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. And we see from this passage a foundation for the task like no other. And again, to quote Tim Chester, imagine trying to visit the king. He actually said the queen, but the queen is dead now, so we're going to talk about the king. Anyway, the king in Buckingham Palace. You're going to be asked, who in the world are you? In other words, what gives you the right to be here, to go into the palace? Most of us are not going to get past the front gate. But what about Kate Middleton? Would she get past the front gate? When she was 15 years old, she would have got no further than any of the rest of us. But now she can say, I am with him. I married the prince. Who is she? Who is she now? She is Her Royal Highness, the Duchess of Cambridge. She gets her identity. She gets that identity from her husband. And in the same way, we get our identity from Jesus, our husband. I'm with him. United to Christ, we are children of God the Father. Back to our passage. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain. Moses said to God, suppose I go to the Israelites, and I say to them, the God your fathers had sent me to you. And they ask me, what is his name? What shall I tell them? In essence, Moses' first question is, who am I that I should do this? And God said, I'll send you. I'll be with you. You'll be just fine. And Moses said, well, who are you? And God said to Moses, I am who I am. And he actually uses that verb to be to reveal something very important about God, that he is the self-existent one. He is the one thing in the universe whose very existence is not dependent. I exist because my parents exist. I'm able to sit here because the chair is holding me up. Everything else is a dependent existence, but God is an independent existence. God is the one who just is. And in essence, he's saying also to Moses, whatever you need me to be, whatever you need, I'm going to be for you. God said to Moses, I am who I am. This is what you were to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, say to the Israelites, the Lord. Notice all caps, the Lord, the I am, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He has sent me to you. This is my name forever, the name you shall call me from generation to generation. And so the foundation of the task is at a name like no other name. And I'd like to illustrate what we're trying to see here from the Leaning Tower of Pisa. I listened to an audio last week about a guy who actually visited there. He said he used to live there and used to go up there. And I think he said it's leaning about 20 feet. And let's imagine that you want to finish the task. Let's imagine you wanted to get that tower taller. Let's imagine it was not finished and you wanted to get it up higher. You wanted to move it up quite a bit. What would you do? Well, you would have to go back to the foundation. You would have to lay a deeper foundation. In other words, to go higher, you must dig deeper. To go higher, you must check the foundation. To do algebra, you have to know your arithmetic. To read Shakespeare, you must know the alphabet. To score a home run, you must make sure that you have first touched first base. And if you want to finish the work that God has given you to do, you need to remember the name that is like no other name, who reminds you that He is the great I am, and that you are completely dependent on Him, and that we cannot accomplish the good work that God has for us to do except that we are completely and totally dependent on Him. And may God richly bless you as you lead your people this week to depend greatly, to depend completely on the great name of the Lord our God.